My name is Holly Cashman. I'm 52 years old, and today is January 3rd, 2025. I'm joining from Newburyport, Massachusetts. That was a little bit of an oral history joke because that is how every oral history recording should start, with the narrator talking or sharing their name, their age, the date, and their location. I'll introduce myself more fully later, but I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this first Friday of 2025. Happy New Year. And I wanted to start out also with a huge thanks to New Hampshire Humanities for inviting me to do this workshop series, helping me plan it and organize it, and think through what might be the most helpful, the most interesting, the most practical kind of introduction workshop. And so Michael Haley Goldman, Beth Salerno, and Katie Malloy, who's on the Zoom meeting this morning, a big thanks to all of you. I am going to advance the slide to this kind of overview of what I hope we'll be able to do today. And that starts out with a welcome, and then participant introductions. Of course, we can't have everybody unmute themselves and introduce themselves, or we would probably use up, a quarter of the time that we have allotted. So I'm hoping that we can use a Zoom poll to kind of get some information and share some information with all of you about who's in the room and what different ideas or questions, expertise, goals that you have that you're bringing to the meeting, the workshop today. After that, we'll kind of jump into the main content of the workshop. What is oral history? Why do oral history? How to do oral history? And this is intended to be kind of a real beginner introduction. But I understand that there is probably a wide variety of experience in the room. And so I'm open to any kind of questions, comments, contributions, disagreement. It's all welcome. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps and some a preview of the next two upcoming workshops in the series, and some announcements from Katie and New Hampshire Humanities. So with that, before we get going into participant introductions, just a couple of Zoom preliminaries to go over. As you've already heard, most likely the Zoom is being recorded, so thank you for agreeing to be part of that recording. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. Please feel free to ask questions and be involved in the workshop. And please feel free to have your cameras off or on as you prefer, whatever is comfortable for you and best facilitates your participation. If my video is not coming through well, or my sound is not coming through well because I am joining using my hotspot rather than my internet, please let me know or let Katie know in the chat, and I can turn off my video as well to help with that. So introductions. Other than my little introduction in the beginning, here's a more serious introduction. I am Holly Cashman. I teach at UNH in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. I'm also core faculty in Women's and Gender Studies and I co-coordinate the queer studies minor. I earned my PhD in romance linguistics, not history, romance linguistics at the University of Michigan, go blue, in 2001, and I taught at Arizona State before coming to UNH in 2008. In 2018, I published a book based on my research that was the result of many, many interviews, but was not an oral history, called Queer, Latinx, and Bilingual Narrative Resources in the Negotiation of Identities. I was trained as a sociolinguist. And so, if anything, I'm hoping that my example can serve as proof that oral history is for everyone, not just for people who are academically trained as historians. Strangely enough, actually, I only connected the dots um, about this the other day. But the reason I'm doing this series of workshops, the reason I got involved in oral history to begin with, was because a collaborator of mine, Tom Kaufhold, who founded the New Hampshire Seacoast LGBT History Project, attended an earlier oral history workshop that was hosted by New Hampshire Humanities, I believe, and he kind of came away feeling overwhelmed with all of the details and preparation and considerations and needs, and decided it was too much to take on. So he reached out to UNH. Eventually, the request for help with oral histories found its way to me. I responded, I got involved, and that kind of started my journey with oral history. Um, and so I'm really happy with how that turned out. However, I really, really don't want anyone to be walking away from this workshop with a similar experience. So I'm hoping that even if it is a ton of information, people will take away the idea that this is a method that is open to everyone, and that with proper preparation and some background research, it is something that anyone can take on. So I'll be weaving in examples from these two oral history projects that I've listed at the bottom of the slide. The oral histories that I'm doing as part of the New Hampshire Seacoast LGBT History Project, and my more recent project, which is the UNH LGBTQ plus oral history project. But the methods and strategies that I'm talking about are applicable to any kind of oral history project, any types of communities. It's not specifically related to LGBTQ plus people and communities specifically. So, what is oral history? We could spend the whole time we have today allotted talking about just this. And I don't want to do that because, based on what you've all said, more kind of practical strategies and tips are what people are interested in, and I think that is fantastic. But I do think that kind of taking a moment to think about what is oral history can help with that as well. So the idea that oral history is kind of a history from below, that's interested in the experiences of everyday people, is, I think, the great starting point. And that relates to an idea that might come up later when we talk about recruiting narrators for oral history projects. Very often people will think and will communicate to you that they're nobody special. They don't have anything interesting to share. And so remembering and kind of helping them to understand that that is what oral history really is about. It's about talking to everyday people about their experiences, how they understand their lives, historical events, their, cultural practices and their communities. That is the purpose of oral history. It does not need to be, oral histories narrated from important people, heads of organization, heads of communities. They can participate as well, but it's not only about them. It's kind of about trying to fill in the historical record with the experiences of everyday people. Um, Oral histories are necessarily incomplete and subjective. So individuals do not have a complete picture of the entire experience of an event, the details of an event. Um, it is their kind of subjective experience, the way they understand their experience and communicate their experience is what we're interested in. And the details, dates, times, all of those kinds of things are things that usually can be found in other places to supplement or to complement what we get from oral histories. And so the focus on kind of that subjective experience is what we are most interested in. It is a specific kind of interviewing and a specific kind of storytelling. And there are lots of kinds of interviewing, kinds of interviews that we do, which we'll touch on in a couple slides, that are different from oral history. One definite difference is that the oral history is meant to be public, meant to be shared, meant to be accessible as part of the public record to complement and kind of fill in the cracks of the history that you get from other sources, from texts, from um, from what we consider kind of traditional history. And so that is an important part when it comes to talking with potential oral history narrators about their participation, their comfort level with that publicly accessible nature. And then also wanting to make sure that they have control over what they do or do not share, um, knowing that the oral history will be shared publicly. Um, so it's also a collaborative process. So the oral history is something that is created between the oral history narrator um, and the interviewer. It's a joint product or a joint kind of final product that is a combination of the stories that the narrator tells in answer to the questions um, that the interviewer asks. So when we're looking at creating and preparing and getting as much as possible out of the oral history, we're looking at kind of how we can help prepare the narrator to give the best kind of interview possible, and also how we can prepare the best questions possible to get the most out of the interview. I'm taking a quick look at the chat and the hands. Please, if you have any questions as we're going along, any comments, do not hesitate to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. Just a reminder about that. And then the last thing I'll touch on about what is oral history is really privileging depth over breadth. So the depth of an individual's experience and their understanding of their experiences, of historical events, of local, national, international events, whatever the focus of your oral history project is, over the breadth. Breadth might come, depending on the project, depending on the focus, by including a number of narrators, by including a diversity of perspectives, but the oral history itself, the individual oral history, privileges depth over breadth. Um, so that is kind of a very brief introduction, and I've included two quotes. One is from the Oral History Association. Their website, oralhistory.org, has a lot of great resources, and they define oral history as a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. Kind of a very simple, straightforward definition. And Summer and Quinlan, authors of I think it's the fourth edition now, oral history manual, published by Roman and Littlefield, say oral historians seek to explore and document narrators' understanding or interpretation of their experiences in past times, places, and ways of life. So two kind of very straightforward definitions of oral history that really highlight kind of narrators' understanding and the voices of people, which is what we're really talking about. So how does that differ from all these other, all these other, and that's just a few, I'm sure people can think of others, and all these other interview methods. Journalism was brought up by someone in the initial poll. And so you kind of think of like interviewing as a key component of journalism, usually um, also involving kind of observation, maybe. But it's another way of including kind of firsthand accounts of events. Um, but journalism differs greatly in a lot of ways. The output, kind of articles or news reports that are almost always kind of mediated by the journalist, by the person who's writing the article or the news story, versus the oral history, which is generally presented very much the original words of the narrator. It might be transcribed, it might be indexed. People might go through and highlight here are the topics and themes that emerge. And so the oral history can be mediated in that way. But the original words of the narrators themselves are what an oral history produces. And that varies greatly from the approach in journalism. Also, kind of the questions we ask, we're not necessarily focused solely on who, what, where, why, when, how. We're looking at individuals' um, subjective experiences, how they understand what happened in the past. And that is kind of a very different type of question that you ask to try to get to those types of answers. A lot of surveys can use an interviewing technique, but we're not trying to get kind of a generalization about broader trends and data. Of course, with oral history, we can look at how individuals' experiences fit within a bigger historical context. So it's not that we don't care about context, but we're not looking at a quantitative analysis, and we're not looking at trying to kind of generalize over a set of data. And the questions, while we might start out with kind of an outline for an interview, what types of questions we might ask and what topics we want to cover, um, the interview is going to be a lot less structured than a survey. We're going to want to be flexible. We're going to want to ask follow-up questions. We're going to want to ask different people different questions based on things that they share with us, and go off in different directions that might be interesting. Hopefully not go off on tangents that take us very far away from the topic of the project, but um, definitely a lot more flexibility than you think of in survey interviews, where a lot of times people are, it's a yes, no, or it's a multiple choice rather than trying to design questions that will elicit long answers. Um, Dialectology and sociolinguistics, I included this. That's my sociolinguistics is my background. That's what I was trained in. And it is a really interesting kind of different approach. It's the interviewing that I was trained to do involved trying to get people to talk as much as possible without paying attention to the way that they're talking, in order to try to get at some vernacular variety of the language. So the content of what people were saying in a traditional sociolinguistic interview is less important than the form. And with dialectology, you're looking at trying to get talking about cultural practices or traditions to access maybe different lexical items in a person's language, or different grammatical structures that might vary from the norm of a given language. So it's a lot of focus on form rather than content, even if the questions are designed to get people to talk a lot. Um, Focus groups, kind of in a way similar to surveys. You're looking at opinions, attitudes of the people that you're interviewing. It's a group instead of a one-on-one, which is the more common approach for oral history. And there's much less of a focus on kind of the individual personal biographical information and experiences, and much more of a focus on people's opinions and attitudes kind of in the here and now, rather than understanding of past events. Um, Ethnographic interviews, I think that's another one where there's a kind of a lot of overlap, and ethnographic interviews are used in a lot of different social science approaches, anthropology being the most obvious one, and does have kind of an interest in understanding people's behavior, their cultural practices, their perspectives. It's often part of a broader approach that involves observation and participant observation. And again, another big difference in this one is um, how what the goal of the project is, and how and what happens with the interview. So very rarely would ethnographic interviews be published, kind of made accessible to the public in their original form, in the kind of in the words of the interviewee, or the kind of representative of the cultural group that you're interviewing. They would be mediated kind of by the researcher and presented in part of a bigger analysis. And that is not to say that oral histories can't be subsequently used. by researchers in other ways that might result in publications that are different from just the actual oral history and the person's individual experiences. So that is just a very brief attempt to go over what oral history isn't, or how it might differ from other kinds of approaches that involve interviewing. Does anyone want to jump in with thoughts or comments about other approaches, or what oral history is or isn't in their experience? Not seeing any hands or anyone unmuting. Oh, I see one hand. Yes, Jenna.
I really like that you brought up the idea of depth over breadth. We have some oral history. I found an oral history with a World War II vet in our collection, and I was so excited to incorporate that into a project we were doing. But it was sort of a running list of I went from here to here, I served here, and then there's no, however the interview worked, there was no personal experience tied to it. It was like a CV.
Yeah.
And it's would have been wonderful to hear more about the personal experiences that the person had, as opposed to the broad, here's my whole history outline, without that content. So I think that's a really good point considering breadth over depth. I just wanted to say I like that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it is really hard in the interview, in the moment, to kind of think about, okay, how can I shift this? How can I change? How can I get deeper answers? And we can talk about that in the next workshop in more depth. But yes, I think I've had the opposite experience too, where someone is going into so much detail about something that has nothing to do with the topic of the project. And it's like, oh, this is incredibly fascinating, but how can we bring this back? And it is a really hard thing to manage in the moment. I think I saw another hand. Was it Jenny?
So I saw in the chat an interesting question about historical accuracy with interviewees, and I just want
Oh,
to.
fantastic.
So my experience, I've done interviews with French speakers in New Hampshire, but I'm more interested in history of people with disabilities. That's my son, but there's a lot of oral histories of survivors of like people in Laconia, if you've watched Lost in Laconia. And what I think is interesting is the experience of survivors, and what they think doesn't always match with what happened. But there's a truth in that experience that goes beyond. I know, I hear you, buddy. That goes beyond facts. So, as an historian, if I was to do a history of the Laconia State School, I would include those oral histories, and a lot, like, one thing about them is like a lot of survivors get very angry with their parents for putting them in Laconia, which they have every right to do. But they don't necessarily think about the socioeconomic position. Like, their parents might have had 15 kids and couldn't feed them. And Laconia was the only option, instead of being angry at the way they were treated or that the state didn't help them stay at home. So I would say it might not be our job as interviewers and as people that put the oral history out there to necessarily say, to tell, especially in the moment, because I feel like you'd want to validate a person's experience, and that as their truth without being accurate, if that makes any sense to me. to you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you flagging up the comment in the chat as well as your contribution. So the question in the chat was about, do you include facts and information given by the interviewee you know to be historically inaccurate? Does the exclusion of inaccurate information undermine the goal of capturing an interviewee's perspective and experiences? And I think that comment in the chat from folks from the National Historical Society and Jenny's comment as well, reflecting on that. This is so important and kind of goes to the heart of that history from below versus kind of the history that you get from the official record, and what does it mean to include subjective experiences of people. And sometimes it means that you have contradictions and you have a challenge of how you want to deal with that when you're presenting about the oral histories. But like, for example, well, two things. One thing is that a best practice of oral history is to give the narrator access to the oral history after it's completed and kind of go through, if it's possible, questions, confirm information, give the narrator an opportunity to kind of amend, add, change. If they're, oh yes, I misspoke. I said that was Joe and it was actually George. Those kinds of things. Or, oh, you know what? After I said that, I realized, no, it was in 1947, not 1957. I just misspoke. And this is kind of something that lots of different disciplines have dealt with, kind of dealing with testimony, for example. And in testimonials, people are recounting their personal experience, and then people will say, okay, these are 75 different ways that this account does not align with the historical record, and use that kind of to discount someone's personal experience. But we're looking at including kind of a both and approach, and uh, not necessarily privileging kind of the facts over the personal experience, as a way of kind of making the record more complete, even if it makes it more complex and kind of uh, problematic in that way. And I think there was one more thing I want to add, but I also see that Wendy has a hand up. And so let's go to Wendy's comment and then I'll share my other thought before we move on. Wendy. Oh, but you need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Perfect.
Is that better?
Yes, we can
All
hear
right.
you.
It's actually Tracy.
Oh,
Wendy and I are
Tracy.
from the Hampton Falls Historical Society, and this is something you may well be going to address. But how do you feel about providing the person we're going to interview with an outline of the questions that we might be presenting to them? Actually, our focus for the most part has been older people in town, quite frankly, before they are deceased. And sometimes they have felt a little more comfortable knowing how we're going to approach the questions and such. What do you think about that? Or is this something you're going to touch upon later on?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question, Tracy. I appreciate you bringing that up. I think I am a big fan of whatever, and we can talk more about this in the second workshop that's kind of the deep dive on interviewing, and making the interview as good as possible. I am in favor of any approaches and techniques that will help the interview to be as rich, as detailed, as full as possible, and that will help the narrator feel as in control and comfortable with the experience. So yes, if that includes sharing the outline of the interview and the interview questions ahead of time, absolutely. If it includes kind of going over the questions in a pre-interview um, conversation, going through the method and the process in a pre-interview, um, and then following up and giving the narrator a chance to reflect on the interview, add, amend. I'm absolutely in favor of all of that. Maybe maybe it's not fair to journalism to say that that's another big difference, is that we're not looking at gotcha questions. We're not trying to surprise people. And right, if we're talking about things that happened decades and decades and decades ago, to have the opportunity to think about it, to reflect on it, to really do that preparation work as a narrator, can only enrich the experience and what comes out of it. Do other people have thoughts about either Tracy or Jenny's questions or comments that they want to share? Yeah, Jenna.
Sorry. Yeah, I would agree that anything you can give in advance just to get somebody thinking, because most likely if it's something that they really care about, and they didn't get to think it through enough to tell a full story, it's going to be with them after. And you're going to be getting follow-up emails, or, oh, I should have said this and now I thought of this, and because it's important. And then you've sort of missed that opportunity to capture it as part of the oral history. So that's one thing that we've talked a lot about with our project, is creating a packet in advance, or having specific prompts for an oral history. If we do a day where we interview people to this is the topic we're going to talk about. So we don't want it really structured. We want it to be a conversation, but at the same time, I've done a lot of interviews where somebody comes back later and is like, well, this is what I really wanted to say, and now that I've thought about it. And you can always try to do follow up, but it's easier to get it done in the moment you've planned.
Thank you. And no, don't apologize for jumping in. I'm so glad you are. And I wanted to just comment back to Jenny's point before I forget. The second thing I was going to say, that about, do you or maybe this was the from the chat from National Historical Society. Do you interrupt someone? Do you contradict someone? Do you correct someone during the interview? I think there is a you could again, you could go in lots of different ways, and a lot of it might have to do with your style, your rapport, or your relationship with the person that you're interviewing. I think if there's something that just seems like a like someone misspoke, like it's a just kind of said the wrong year, um I wouldn't I most likely wouldn't hesitate to jump in. Like if, it's a major historical event. I'm thinking in my case, working with LGBTQ plus communities, and someone says, well, back in 1972 in the Stonewall riots, I might jump in and say, did you mean 69? Like, just correct the date in the moment, no big deal. But anything kind of more than that, or if someone says, oh, the person who was, the dean of students at UNH at the time, I can't remember who it was. And I'll say, maybe you're thinking of Bill Kidder, I'll kind of prompt with a name or something. But beyond things like that, I probably wouldn't correct someone or interrupt someone. I might try to find another way to come back to it, kind of to have a second go at an opportunity. But yeah, I would be concerned about changing the dynamic. And we're going to talk a little bit later, briefly touch on the idea of kind of power differentials and that kind of situation. I would be worried about that. Hunter.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. I just wanted to, add some comments around the idea of sharing questions beforehand. So part of our approach at the Historical Society of Cheshire County over this last year was actually to develop the questions with the narrators. And so it's even going a step beyond sharing the questions that we developed and helping, right, with that real collaboration, so that we're co-creating, right, the stories that will be told.
That is such an important point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, and especially when you are um, not a member of the community you're researching, when you're not a member of the generation of people you're speaking with, that becomes even more important, right? Because you might not even know what questions to ask. But even if you are a member, you only have your partial view, your implicit biases, and so having more input into the process of creating the interview questions in the first place is fantastic. And then being able to pivot and to really respond to what you're hearing in the actual interview and build on answers in a way that can get even further is fantastic. Any other comments or questions before we move into kind of the why oral history? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. So pretty briefly, I think since about I think it was 70% of you are already kind of actively in an oral history project, and more are thinking about a specific project. It doesn't feel like I need to spend too much time convincing anyone of the value of oral history. So I will just share kinds of these thoughts, and you may have other thoughts to add, but that oral history offers a unique perspective on historical events. You can preserve otherwise ephemeral, ordinary experiences that might not otherwise get preserved. You really can work on relationship building through the kind of methods focus on listening, increasing understanding across differences, either in the interview itself, if it's intergenerational, if it's an interviewer and an interviewee, kind of a narrator from different communities, or you can also kind of look at how this can build communities. So increasing understanding through the public's access to the stories after they're recorded and preserved and made public. One of the main values of oral history is really broadening the inclusion of voices who aren't normally included in the historical record. So people from marginalized groups of all kinds, and then just kind of the idea of ordinary experiences of ordinary people versus the experiences that usually get kind of recorded and become part of the record. So that representation piece. And then so many people are here representing organizations, kind of how oral histories can contribute to really interesting programming that is local, that includes members of the community, that is important to members of the community because it reflects their histories and their experiences. Does anyone want to add? I feel like we're now in danger of running short on time, so I don't need to open it up if anyone has anything burning that they want to add about why they care about oral history, I don't want to close that down. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands or unmuting, so I'm going to jump into the getting started. So my biggest takeaway, if there's only one thing that you leave this workshop with, it is get started. So a couple of people have already mentioned today that in some cases, for some projects, there is the time clock ticking just on kind of people's natural lifespans that make getting oral history getting oral histories recorded very urgent on some topics. And we can kind of find ourselves letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, postponing and postponing and postponing until we have X, Y, or Z. And then that can end up kind of missing stories that we wish we had recorded. In my Seacoast, New Hampshire LGBTQ oral history project, 3 of the participants that I interviewed have subsequently passed away, and several people on my list to be interviewed have also passed away, and that is something that will haunt me for a while, that I wasn't able to get those interviews recorded. In a couple of cases, it was because I was not able to convince the narrators that they had a story that was worth telling. And in another case, it was because someone just wasn't comfortable with the public nature of sharing his story, which I understand and respect. So all that said, it is important to get your ducks in a row before you start as much as possible. And so these next kind of quick points are things to think about when you're getting started. I won't spend a whole lot of time about finding a topic or focus because it seems like a lot of people have a specific topic in mind. But if you don't have a specific topic in mind, talk to people. I think talking to people and researching your community or your group is the best way to find a topic that would be of interest to you and to your community. And then once you have a topic, kind of really trying to think about ways to focus it, whether it's through the questions that you're creating, whether it's through the narrators that you reach out to. And again, there's that depth versus breadth issue that all of us will deal with when we're doing this work. Once you have a topic, identifying narrators, the question of who is the best person to tell this story? Whose story is this? Whose experience is this? Uh, what are the kind of time frames and time considerations involved that might prioritize some narrators over others? In the case of our Seacoast, New Hampshire project with the LGBTQ community, our project focus started out on the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in 1969 and how those events were experienced locally. And so that really impacted our search for narrators. It really determined kind of the age of the people we were looking for, and people who were in the Seacoast at that time period of the late 60s, early 70s. And so as the project has evolved, our focus has broadened a bit. That anniversary passed, we presented and had a lot of programming around that anniversary. And then we moved on to the 400th and took kind of a different tack there. And now the plan is to kind of try to diversify the group as much as possible, in terms of age, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of identities. And so that is one kind of way that identifying narrators relates to a topic and to the focus of the project um, as it kind of evolves over time. I also think for recruiting narrators, going to where people are, kind of being connected with the groups that they're members of, getting on agendas for meetings that folks will be attending. I once did a sample oral history interview with a narrator in front of a community group to kind of give people the idea of this is what an oral history looks like, and this is what it's like to participate. And it was a terrifying but very fun, in the end, experience, I think, for both me and the narrator. And several people kind of were recruited from that initial event. And then once people are involved, they might recommend it to their friends, family members, acquaintances, neighbors, etc. So building your group from there. Oops, I skipped over ethical considerations. So one of the things that I think is the most important point around ethical considerations, kind of what do we need to do to treat the narrators of the oral history as ethically as possible. And that can involve kind of the selection of the narrator to begin with. Are we representing the community well? Is there a diversity of voices? Who are we selecting as interviewers for the project? Are they people that we know and trust to carry out the interview in an ethical way? How might they be made aware of their implicit biases that could impact the interview? Um, what are kind of the risks and the benefits for participants in taking part in this project, and how are we making them aware of those risks and benefits? In the academic setting, I am required to go through the institutional review board process for research on what are called human subjects, as much as I dislike that terminology. And so we're required to spell out risks and benefits and create an informed consent form for the potential narrators to hopefully understand what is their time commitment, what are the risks of participating, what are the benefits of participating, what will happen to the recording after the interview, what rights do you have as a participant in the research, etc. Outside of the academic context, there is usually a different approach that involves a release form or a deed of gift. And all of these forms, you can find examples of online. You don't need to create them from scratch. But they all kind of have at the heart, whichever process you are going through, the idea of making sure that the narrator understands what they're signing up for and that they have control over the experience to the extent possible, even if that means in the end deciding, nope, I'm not comfortable with this being published or being part of the project, and I'm going to decide to not sign off on the release. And people can put all sorts of other conditions on the publication, and we should figure out ways to let them do so, whether they want to use a pseudonym, whether they want to not have it published until after their death or after a certain amount of time has passed, whether they're only comfortable with only comfortable with audio, or only comfortable with the text of the transcript versus audio or video. So all of those kind of considerations should happen kind of at the beginning of the project before the interviews are done and the histories are recorded. And then I think another ethical consideration that we don't necessarily think of right away at the outset is the responsibility to make the oral histories public, to have them publicly accessible, and to have the project be sustainable beyond an individual's kind of commitment to the project. So now that people have given their time, have maybe brought up kind of these challenging and difficult memories, have invested all of this in the project, it's our responsibility to make sure it is preserved long term. And that can be really challenging when it comes to evolving technology, particularly. So I am running through these, but I'm hoping we're going to have time for questions, and we are going to have time for questions, and we're also going to be able to talk about all of this related to our specific case study. And so identifying kind of what are your resources and challenges at the outset, whether are you associated with community groups and organizations that can offer support of financial, time, volunteers, etc. What kind of costs might there be, and how can you seek to cover those costs? Grant writing, other kinds of funding. I'm going to skip over with resources and challenges. Also, experts kind of in the community. We're so lucky in New Hampshire. Maybe it's everywhere, but I think it's a very New Hampshire thing. We're so lucky to have so many people who have such incredible levels of expertise in our communities, even our small communities. And so figuring out kind of who those people are and how they might want to be connected, and how that can help push your project forward, is a great thing to do as you're starting out on the project. Costs, I think a lot of the technology we have now, there are a lot of things that are free or low cost that can help save a lot of time. But then there's kind of the ethical challenge part of it, which is how are these platforms and technologies handling our data, and who are they sharing it with, and what control do we have? What control are we giving up? And so those are all really important questions to ask when it comes to costs. So having a human being volunteer in your project, transcribe an interview manually versus uploading a file to a platform and having it transcribed in a matter of seconds. Each of those has different costs, and you're gaining and losing things in either of those options. That kind of relates right directly into technology. Technology is a double-edged sword for sure. And there are incredible kind of end-to-end oral history platforms, like Their Story, that you can do a recording in person or remotely. It can be automatically transcribed, automatically indexed, create video clips, create videos, do all sorts of amazing things. But they can be expensive. And some platforms, not Their Story, but some platforms do definitely have concerns around who controls your data, and do you get to take it with you if you no longer subscribe? And so that is a sustainability question. So making sure that whatever technology you use aligns with your values, aligns with the values of the project, and leaves you with access to your data in the end is very important. Sustainability we've already touched on, but kind of the importance of thinking of ourselves as kind of stewards of these histories and making sure that future generations will have access to them is very important. Also, and that's kind of the big focus of the third workshop, the deep dive we're doing, but also making sure that we're looking at our time and energy, our organization's time and energy, our volunteers' time and energy in ways that are sustainable, because it's easy for these projects to kind of take over and then end up with lots of data and stories that we aren't able to process and handle and publicize. I think every organization might have an example of a box of tapes or CDs or mini cassettes or other other formats of oral histories that are sitting in storage somewhere that are not accessible, and that is not how we want to be handling people's stories. Rather than ask for questions right now, what I'm hoping everyone will be okay with is to jump into our case study to make sure we have plenty of time to hear from Jenna and Hunter, who are our first group that is going to share their project. I'll have a few questions, but most importantly, I'll open up to questions from you. So please think of your questions, put them in the chat as you have them. You don't need to hold them till the end. And then after our conversation about the Voices of Pride project, we'll have time for a quick wrap up and any general questions before we end. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Hunter and Jenna.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, so as long as people can see me, I suppose.
I can unshare my
Yeah, okay.
slide and I can try to see if I'm allowed to pin you and Hunter so that people can see you. I think hopefully that worked. Did I pin you for everyone or just for myself? I might
Can people see me?
spotlight for everyone. That's what I will do. Spotlight is the correct word, not pin.
All right,
There
now
we
I see me.
Perfect.
Hi, Hunter. I want to thank you for letting us jump in on your workshop, and also New Hampshire Humanities for letting us talk about our project. And we're sort of we've started our project, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then we're also going into another phase of things, so we're kind of midstream in this. But I'm the executive director of the Historical Society of Cheshire County in Keene, and we've been doing a lot around incorporating oral history interviews into the projects that we do. And we do about 150 programs a year, and we also do about 2 to 3 exhibits, changing exhibits every year. And so a lot of times what we're doing is just speaking with somebody from the community that can help add new dimension to the types of programs that we have been doing. And that's been something we've done consistently, maybe in the last 5 years, I would say. And what we've found is it's really helped to enhance the educational goals of our exhibits, to address multiple learning styles as well. So we have people that just come in to watch these videos, and then they're going around and reading all the text. After 30 years in museums, I could say I speed read through exhibits, and I'd rather watch a video myself. But it also has allowed the participants to take ownership in the topic and the project and see themselves as part of the mission of our organization, which has been really helpful. And I can add too that it really helps when you're going for funding to be able to show something. So we've incorporated some of these videos into some of those fundraising as well. So For example, we did an exhibit on the history of summer camps in the Monadnock region and interviewed quite a few people. And from that, we have new volunteers, and we have people become members, and which is wonderful, but also just having that shared experience. We wouldn't have had those stories otherwise. And so the other thing I wanted to add is just that for years, this has been a discussion to work with the LGBTQIA plus community to do some sort of oral history project. And it's in keeping with some of the other projects we've done over the past decade to just say, whose stories haven't we shared, and what stories are we missing? Where are the gaps in our collection? And so we've done projects around women's history. We've worked with the immigrant community, and all of these have been what's the history, but also what's the contemporary culture today, with people of color in the community and Indigenous history as well. And so this is just this topic was just one of many that we had formulating over the years, and then this opportunity arose to be able to make that sort of happen in 2024, as opposed to the calendar year that we had set is like maybe in 2025, as we finish up some other projects. So especially I think with COVID, we're finding that there's so many people that want to access this kind of content. We always say that about really 60% of our visitors never enter the front door. Our YouTube channel has exploded. And so we're reaching and providing local history to people all over the country now. And this is one means that we're able to do that really successfully. And it's lent itself then to creating curriculum for schools, and new programs and guided tours that we give and all of that. So just that's sort of the background as to why the Historical Society is excited to do this project. We call it Voices of Pride, Preserving LGBTQIA plus Oral Histories in the Monadnock region, which is our collection scope. So as this opportunity arose for us, one of the first things we did is say, all right, what are the goals of the project and who's our team? And Hunter was brought in, thank God, to help us as our community liaison and as a lead on the project, to be able to work with our staff throughout this process. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the goals, and for us it was two-part, because we get asked now to do a lot of oral histories. We've sort of been playing around with this idea of creating a space where we can create a welcoming area or space to allow members of the community to come in and interview loved ones or family. So sort of the StoryCorps style space. And so we were able to use this funding that we received this year to create an oral history studio. And so the Voices of Pride project is our pilot project for that. And then afterwards, it's going to become a community space that people can come to. And then we had our goals surrounding just specifically, how do we want to do relationship building, and what are the goals for this project, this oral history project in particular. And so we didn't jump right into doing oral histories. It took quite a while to get to that point for us, because it seemed like there was so much that we needed to sort of have in place and understand as we went through this process. So we spent a lot of time on planning and development, and creating what we call our, we have a processing guide that sort of lays out the logistics of how we wanted to approach this. And we also did some training. All of us on our team did the StoryCorps DIY training, which is wonderful. It's free, and it gives you a lot of ideas for consent forms and pre-visit packets and all of these kinds of things. So it was really a nice way of us going through this process of figuring out what our project is and what our goals were. And we did some training too with our board and our staff and volunteers. And Hunter was able to come in and speak to everyone, and kind of we were able to lay out, this is what we'd like to be doing with this project. This is what it means. Here are some of the history of New Hampshire, LGBT history in New Hampshire, and here are some of the contemporary issues. And Hunter, jump in if I'm speaking out of turn, or there's something else you'd like to say around that. which I think was just really valuable because it brought everyone into the fold as to what this project was and where it would be heading in case there were some questions. And we even, from that, what came out of that from our board was it'd be wonderful to just have some talking points as this project is underway, and how, if somebody approaches us about the project, how can we answer some questions? And so that was really, I think, valuable. These are all things that you write a grant saying this is how it's going to work, and then it morphs, and for the better always. So we like that. And so I think the big part of what we started with after those goals, and it was a timeline of how we wanted to do it in our project team. We have a media technician who works with us on the technology and doing the oral history. And that was part of an American Heritage Association grant to start to develop technology, get cameras, because we were doing so much with YouTube and hybrid programming. And then having Hunter come in as, I said, community liaison, reaching out to organizations and individuals and sort of trying to figure out who we might want to go to partner with us in creating this project. And we also had somebody with marketing and somebody helping with grant writing and sponsorships, because we wanted to have business sponsors help us along the way, and foundation help. So as far as the logistics go with our planning document we created, we looked through how are we going to recruit? What is that process going to be like? What do we do in preparation for a recording day if somebody's coming in? How do we schedule something with a narrator? What's the as Hunter said, what are the questions we might, working with a narrator, and what we might want to ask, and sending a packet in advance to somebody to get ready. And then what happens on recording day? So we developed a checklist. What's the technology that needs to be set up and ready to go? And our consent forms and all of that in place so that we're just ready to hopefully have a smooth experience. And so there've been bumps along the way. I'm really glad we got funding for a pilot project. I think it was so much more valuable to have that than to have jumped right into a huge project and realized there are so many things we could be doing differently. And then a lot of it was also, how are we going to archive these stories? And so we've developed a processing guide around that as well. Accessioning and cataloging and archiving and providing access is all part of our project as a historical society. And one of the things we did decide is what we're cataloging, what we're archiving is the raw file. And then anything beyond that, if we were to use it for an educational program or curriculum or YouTube, whatever it is, that what we're doing is having a reference copy that would be an edited version of that. And then we also decided that because we use Past Perfect, other historical societies here might as well. It slows down quickly if you have huge files in it. So we created mini trailers for our videos so that as we get them into our database and people could come in our library and do a search for something, that they're able to watch a mini clip of that interview before requesting access to it. So those are some of the things we kind of worked out just logistic wise. And then I'd love to turn it over to Hunter, because Hunter was brought in and working with the community members and how that went.
Sure. Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Holly, for inviting us in, for creating this beautiful workshop space. I have some background about me. So I've spent 31 of the 38 years of my life living in Cheshire County. I, of course, have really deep roots here. I'm a queer and trans person. I worked at Keene State College for many years, working with LGBTQ students there. And something right through my own experience and working with those students are really sensing a gap of understanding who we are, particularly in this place, what it means to be queer and from New Hampshire, and having a real sense of connection and community from that. And so oral history is such a beautiful way, right, to help, of course, fill in the historical narrative, but also, right, just to connect ourselves, right, to the place that we're from and the communities that we're a part of. and to recognize, yeah, the value of our stories. And there can be real healing that comes from that also, from the remembering and that connection. I think about that a lot in this current political climate that we're in. But anyway, people want to feel a part of something bigger. We want a sense of belonging and connection. And storytelling is such a great way for us to reveal parts of ourselves as well as see ourselves reflected in other people. And so in the process of doing this oral history project, so much of my focus is on that relationship building, community building. So thinking not only about the product, and so thinking about the oral histories that will be available, but thinking also about the process and then obviously the relationships that we're building along the way, and really valuing each of those pieces equally. And so we're being really thoughtful. So I love, right, all the discussion about informed consent and ethics, how we're really honoring the folks who are coming in and being really vulnerable in many cases and sharing things, having that recorded, having it publicly available. And so how are you really honoring the folks who are coming in to share their story? And through that, right, that individual relationship building, having that grow, right, you're creating kind of a scaffolding. And so as you're building individual relationships, you're also building a greater sense of community and connection, right, to people, right, within this region and larger community. And there's just so many opportunities in doing that. I also think about the relationship building between the Historical Society of Cheshire County and within the greater community, which is also, I wouldn't even say it's a side benefit, it's a benefit of doing this kind of work, of how you're really inviting people in to the work that's happening. So it doesn't feel separate or disconnected, which I know can happen a lot in academic spaces as well, that it's more of an observer rather than a collaborator. And so there's been a lot of learning, as Jenna mentioned. It was very much a pilot, but I think there's such value in learning by doing, because there's only so much preparation you can do before you're entering in to a project like this, and things that you wouldn't think of. You think, right, things are all set up, and then you hear the audio and you are like, oh, we need to change some things. Great, that's good information to have.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the because you did the interviews, and
maybe I could speak to my role at all. So my role in this project, was as the main was the interviewer for the oral histories, as well as the community liaison. So a lot of my role was, of course, helping develop parts of the plan and process, as well as identifying narrators, onboarding them, and then doing the interviews. So we did, for our pilot, we did 2 long form interviews and then 6 short form, what we called sound bites, just to get more folks involved and create different points of access and opportunity. I
think there's a lot of discussion around, like, how long do we want an interview to be, and so we had sort of fallen on this. All right, let's say that 45 minutes is sort of our max of what we think we could accomplish, because realizing too that at some point we're going to have to think long term about our file storage needs and how large our server can get and all of that. And so in thinking about the interviews and having watched it back, one of the things that we thought is, all right, we need a prompt to tell people that we're at a half-hour mark, let's kind of wrap things up. And we realized that the knock on the door of the oral history studio was like super disruptive. When you're really listening to someone's stories and then there's knocking, you're like, like little kinds of things. What type of mic are you going to use? So if you string together some oral histories, if somebody's using a lavalier mic and it's super clear and crisp, and somebody else has a microphone placed in front of them, it's jarring to go back and forth. So just all of that technical stuff didn't necessarily enter into the interview process, but as we watch it back, we've learned a lot, I think. I think one of the things, Hunter, you're saying is so important, is that we've begun to develop these relationships and bring people into the fold as creating history. And some of those initial participants are going to continue with us and help us through the next phase of our project. Is as consultants on maybe some of the audio, but also in figuring out what is this timeline history, what is the narrative that we're piecing together, and what can we do with that as a next phase, which I think is really exciting to see that process of relationship building happen.
Yeah, I really appreciate about this project that we kept it really broad, actually, as we were thinking about the stories that we're trying to tell, right? So we're preserving LGBTQIA oral histories in the Monadnock region. That's incredibly broad. And so we didn't know the stories that we were going to hear. We didn't know, right, what form things are going to take. And so we just wanted to leave it really open, which sometimes can be a little scary because you're letting go of control. You're really sharing the power with the narrators of what the project will develop into. And I think that's been a really beautiful experience. Again, this co-creation piece and how we are, honoring both of these roles, I think, right, as steward and as narrator, to really create something that we couldn't create, right, with just one of those sides. Yeah.
I think and having it be so broad that it was scary because it's kind of scary to put a narrator in a position of saying, okay, now just talk, and so the feedback we got was we decided as a phase 2 that what we'll do is have specific prompts, or maybe it's like, okay, this month we're focused on this topic, and we kind of have a better sense of what those topics might be, like the AIDS epidemic and AIDS services, for instance, or marriage equality as a topic. And so those are starting to surface. The only thing we were very intentional about is that we wanted to be multi-generational. And I think a lot of oral history projects, and when we've done things in the past, training is that everybody wants to just, we have to hurry up and interview the oldest people in the community. But everybody in your community comes and goes throughout, and there's something to be said for all stages of that, what that narrative might be, mid 20th century to early 21st century. And we wanted to be very intentional about that. And so I don't know if that made it harder for you, Hunter, to find people, and what you noticed in those when we had older people and younger people being interviewed.
I mean, it wasn't terribly difficult to identify those folks. So the two long form interviews that we did, we had a rising senior, she's a senior now, but a 17-year-old member of our community and a 66-year-old member of our community. They have different identities, of course, very different lived experience, of course, just based on those ages. And of course, there's lots of difference in lots of different ways. And I don't know, right? I love this process. It's such an honor, really, to be the interviewer, to get to sit in the room and be able to listen to folks share their story. So I don't have anything terribly insightful or whatever to say about it, but
I think everything you've both had to say incredibly useful and very, very helpful. And I want to make sure that we have time to open to questions
Sure.
from the group. I don't know if I don't see anything in the chat, but if people want to put something in the chat or want to raise their hands, I would say raise your hands using the feature and not physically, because I can't necessarily see all of you with Jenna and Hunter pinned. But I have questions that I can certainly ask, but I'd rather have you ask questions if you have them. Wonderful participants. I'm waiting to see hand. I can ask one question while we're waiting for hands to be raised or questions to be put in the chat. I think you've spoken really well to this kind of tension between wanting to get started, but wanting to have everything lined up. And the pilot project is a really great way of doing that. Do you have like one piece of advice? If I'd known this before I started, I would have done X, Y, or Z. Just one kind of takeaway that you would offer people.
I don't know, Hunter, do you? that surprised, I think I would say one bit of advice is don't be so structured in what you expect your end product to be. So for us in having, and a lot of times when you're writing a grant, you really need to know what that end product is going to be. We are going to have this amazing event and create a film and have a festival, whatever. And I think that with oral history projects in particular, what I find is we don't know where it's going to lead us. We don't know what the most important pieces of this project are going to be. And to leave room to pivot and leave room to embrace what comes from those stories and have whatever your educational programming or public component of this is going to be sort of come from those experiences, I think would be really important for a project, whatever the topic is.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know that I got a, yeah,
Can I?
sorry. I don't know that I got a new lesson, but something, right, just.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, could Jenna, the question in the chat about what is your YouTube channel address? Maybe you.
Oh, it's Historical Society of Cheshire County.
Okay. If you can and want to pop a link into the chat while
Okay,
Hunter.
I'll do that in Hunter.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know that I had whatever. So I don't have a lesson that I'm taking from it, but something to really re-emphasize, which is, harkening back to my comments. But it's so much about the relationship. It's so much about how you're really centering the interviewer, centering their agency, their storytelling. It's really how you're taking care of and tending to them as an individual in all of their humanity. Because it's a very vulnerable thing to share your story and have it be within a historical record. That's not a typical experience for most individuals. And so how to really work with them throughout the process of helping them feel comfortable and prepared to do this work and continuing to honor that work afterwards. That even though the interview is over, that the relationship exists. And so how to continue to maintain that piece, because it's another outcome, it's another, I don't want to say product, but another benefit of this work is really great. Because why? Because why are we doing this? Why does history even matter? And it's about the people. And so how are we taking care of the people?
And I think that's really great. Just to add to that quickly, that one of the things as we move into a phase 2 of this project, which is to do 25 interviews over the course of the year, we realize too that as a museum, as a historical society, we see ourselves as a cultural hub where people can come and make connections, that we provide a space for that to occur. So just as important as doing this project is providing opportunities for participants to get to know each other, come together. And having these check-in moments throughout the year, that came out of a focus group that we did after having done this project, and I hadn't thought of before, but it absolutely makes sense that part of this relationship building is checking in with each other, and so we're going to build that as part of what we do moving forward, just to have those moments.
That sounds fantastic. I think the idea that, like, yes, this cultural organization is for you too, and we want you to be part of it, not just extracting this oral history from you and sending you on your way. I love that. There's a question in the chat from Sally. Are you using an oral history platform, and are you transcribing your interviews?
Hi, Sally. I remember the email from you about this. And you gave us some good ideas for phase 2. So we have a media technician. So we have the cameras. We've had all that stuff set up before. What we did for now is we do want to have an audio, we want to be able to provide either audio or video to anyone based on their comfort level. We want to be able to go and do outreach. So for phase 2, Hunter is putting together, we're calling it like a road show, but whatever that's going to be, where we can go to retirement communities, senior center, libraries, and do like an introduction to this, and try to continue that relationship building, but also to be able to go to somebody's home if that's what it takes, or a place where somebody feels more comfortable. So that's part of what we're doing. We have that equipment and that kind of thing. We're not using an oral history platform per se. I did look into the software, the oral history synchronizer software that Sally had emailed me about, and that seems fabulous. And what it does is basically take an oral history, transcribe it. We're time stamping. We're going through and time stamping our interviews rather than transcribing them at this point, just to get them cataloged. But this would be, we would be able to do oral history transcriptions. And then what I love about it is if we were to put a clip on YouTube, it also creates chapters within the description of the YouTube page, so that somebody could click on one of the chapters and just hear that clip, as opposed to having to scroll through and find it. So I think that's something we'll probably be incorporating, and I can kind of let you know how that's going as we move forward. But we use Past Perfect software for our collections management software, and we're attaching oral histories into that.
Thank
And
you
I
for that
I
answer.
should add we have Vimeo as well. So just thinking through all of these things to, yeah.
Any other questions for Jenna and Hunter before we shift into kind of wrapping up and next steps? I'm hoping that people aren't feeling the overwhelm that I mentioned at the beginning and aren't kind of going into the glazed over portion of their mind. They're thinking about the project. Does anyone have any question, not specifically related to our case study, but more generally about the workshop, about anything that was brought up during the workshop, anything you want to get out there before we close? Yes, Hunter.
I'm curious around your thoughts in terms of compensation for narrators. We had done a stipend for our long form interviews, not our short form. We've been talking about gifts as a way that feels less transactional, but still that is offering something back to the narrators. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on that, Holly.
I think it's a great question, and I think it totally depends on the the project, the context, the goals. I've been in the two different projects I've been personally involved in. We did not do any kind of a compensation or gift or anything for the folks who are narrators in the Seacoast, New Hampshire LGBTQ Oral History Project. And in the UNH LGBTQ Oral History Project, it was something that came up as a total surprise to me and that I was not in control of, but in a good way, I think, because I was able to schedule the interviews to take place at the Alumni Association building on campus. It's a great spot because it has parking available for people right outside of the building, which is rare on our college campus. And so my amazing colleague in alumni relations kind of wanted to greet the folks at the end of their interview and brought with her a lovely collection of UNH swag that I was not expecting and that people were delighted with. And the folks who did the interviews remotely, I believe, received a similar thing through the mail. So it was something that we had not planned, but that people really enjoyed. And I think it could vary depending on the project. I think the idea of paying someone for their story, like you mentioned, the kind of transactional nature, it's how that would be seen kind of worked into a grant. I don't think it is the normal practice of oral history to do that. However, in the spirit of kind of relationship building and community building and creating a connection with an individual that will last beyond the narrating of the oral history, I could see the value of kind of some sort of a token, something recognition of their time, a free membership for the year if it's a connection with an organization that has a membership, a t-shirt, hat, keychain kind of thing, like something that I can see why that would be meaningful to people and would help with that kind of connection.